was studying pigeons pressing levers, but the neuroscience underlying the finding applies identically to the human brain in romantic attachment. And the narcissist's hot and cold cycle is, functionally, a variable reward schedule running on the most powerful reward system the human nervous system possesses, the attachment system. The dopaminergic pathways associated with love, belonging, and being chosen by someone whose regard you have come to need. Here is how it operates in practice. The narcissist does not plan the cycle consciously. This is important to understand because it explains why confronting them about it produces such genuine seeming confusion. The warmth is real when it comes. The withdrawal is driven by their own internal regulation needs. The sudden distance is not a calculated move. It is the narcissist managing their own terror of closeness by creating space, by re-establishing the emotional distance that makes the relationship feel survivable to their psychology. But the effect on you is identical whether it is calculated or not. Your nervous system does not receive intent. It receives the pattern, and the pattern is this: warmth, presence, extraordinary attunement, the feeling of being seen and chosen and entirely wanted. Then withdrawal, coolness, a quality of absence that is all the more destabilizing because of how complete the presence felt before it. Then warmth again, and in the gap between the withdrawal and the return, something happens in your neurobiology that is not metaphorical and not sentimental. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with anticipation and reward-seeking, surges, not when the reward arrives, but in the gap before it, in the uncertainty, in the reaching. Your brain is not bonding to the narcissist during the warm phases. It is bonding during the cold ones. Helen Fisher's neuroimaging research on romantic love and rejection found that the brain regions activated by romantic rejection are the same regions activated by cocaine withdrawal, the dopaminergic reward circuitry firing, not in satisfaction but in desperate seeking. The person who has been subjected to intermittent reinforcement in a romantic relationship is not simply sad about the inconsistency. They are neurobiologically hooked by it. The inconsistency is not the flaw in the attachment. It is the mechanism of the attachment. This is why leaving feels impossible even when staying feels unbearable. This is why the mind keeps returning to someone who keeps withdrawing. And this is why the most dangerous thing about the narcissist's hot and cold cycle is not what it feels like when it is happening. It is what it builds inside you while you are waiting for the warmth to come back. There is a moment that almost everyone who has been in a relationship with a narcissist can identify with uncomfortable precision. A moment where a third person enters the conversation in a way that feels slightly off, not dramatically, not obviously, just slightly wrong. A name dropped with a particular quality of casualness that doesn't quite match the content. A reference to someone who admires them, delivered with just enough detail to land and just enough nonchalance to be deniable. An ex mentioned in a context that didn't require mentioning them. A colleague who really gets them in a way the conversation implies you perhaps do not. You register something, a small shift in your internal atmosphere. A faint but unmistakable pull of something that might be jealousy, might be insecurity, might be the particular discomfort of feeling like the ground beneath a relationship just moved slightly without your consent. That feeling is not paranoia. It is your nervous system accurately reading a behavioral now, and understanding that signal, what it is designed to produce, and why the narcissist deploys it with such reliable consistency, is one of the most practically useful things you can take from this entire conversation. Triangulation, in the clinical literature, refers to the introduction of a third party into a two-person dynamic in a way that shifts the relational power structure. Family systems therapists, beginning with Murray Bowen's foundational work, identified triangulation as a primary mechanism by which unstable two-person systems attempt to manage anxiety. The tension between two people gets diffused by pulling in a third point, redistributing the emotional load across a larger structure. Bowen observed this primarily in family systems. What behavioral science has subsequently documented is that the narcissist uses this same mechanism not to reduce anxiety in the relationship, but to manufacture it, and to direct that manufactured anxiety with considerable precision toward a very specific behavioral outcome. The outcome is this: your attention, your effort, and your emotional energy get redirected away from your own needs and toward the project of maintaining the narcissist's interest. The moment a credible third party enters the relational field, a person who could, plausibly, replace you in the narcissist's regard, your nervous system shifts its primary operational focus. Without conscious decision, without deliberate choice, the attachment system, which is fundamentally a threat detection and threat response system at its evolutionary core, identifies the potential loss of the attachment figure and begins organizing behavior around preventing that loss. You become, in behavioral terms, more compliant, more attentive, more focused on demonstrating value. less likely to raise grievances, assert needs, or create friction of any kind. The narcissist has not asked you for any of this directly. They have simply introduced information inside. The relational environment that your own nervous system converted into a behavioral modification program running entirely on your hardware. Using your own attachment circuitry as the operating system. This is what makes triangulation so technically elegant as an influence mechanism. Robert Cialdini's work on social proof and scarcity identifies both as among the most powerful drivers of human behavioral compliance. We want what others want, and we want more urgently what we perceive we might lose. Triangulation activates both simultaneously. The third party is social proof that the narcissist is desirable. An implied competition converts the relationship from a secure possession into a scarce resource that must be continuously earned. The narcissist, in most cases, is not running this calculation consciously. They are doing what their psychology has learned produces the relational conditions it needs: proximity without the threat of being fully depended upon, desire without the vulnerability of being fully chosen. The third party is never really the point. You are the point. And the third party is simply the instrument used to keep you perpetually auditioning for a role you already have. I want you to think back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the problems, the beginning of the relationship itself, before the hot and cold cycle established itself, before the triangulation started, before any of the patterns we have been discussing became visible enough to name. Go back to the very first phase, when everything felt not just good but extraordinarily good, when the attention was total, when the connection felt unprecedented, when you found yourself thinking often with a mixture of wonder and slight disbelief that you had never been known like this by another human being, that this person saw you in a way nobody had ever quite managed before. I want you to go back there, because that experience was real. The feeling was genuine, and it was also, simultaneously, the opening move of the most psychologically sophisticated setup you will ever encounter in a human relationship. This is what idealization actually is at the behavioral and neurological level. And I want to be precise here because the word gets used loosely in ways that understate what is actually happening. Idealization is not simply infatuation. It is not the ordinary biologically programmed elevation of a new romantic partner that neuroscience has documented in early attachment. It is something more structured than that. More purposeful, not consciously purposeful, but purposeful in the way that any psychological defense mechanism is purposeful. It serves a function. It solves a problem. And understanding what problem it solves is the key to understanding why the fall from the pedestal is not an accident, not a change of heart, not evidence that the love was false. The problem the narcissist is solving with idealization is the same problem that runs beneath every game we have examined. They need you close enough to provide the validation, the mirroring, the external regulation of self that their psychology requires. But closeness, as we established from the beginning, is also a threat. The solution the narcissist system generates is elegant in its dysfunction. They do not get close to you. They get close to an idealized version of you, a version carefully constructed from your real qualities, amplified and curated and assembled into something that is genuinely you, and simultaneously not you at all. You without the ordinary human limitations, inconsistencies, and needs that would, if fully acknowledged, make the relationship feel as dangerous as all relationships feel to the narcissist. The neuroscientist and attachment researcher Stan Tatkin describes the early phase of romantic love as a period of neurobiological alteration where the brain's threat detection systems are temporarily suppressed and its reward circuits are running at full capacity, PI, reducing a state of perception that is chemically distinct from baseline reality. In the narcissist, this process gets recruited by the defensive system and extended far beyond its natural duration because as long as you remain on the pedestal, as long as the idealized version holds, the narcissist can maintain proximity without confronting the terror that genuine intimacy produces. But here's what makes this a setup, rather than simply a phase. The idealized version of you was built without your full participation. You did not agree to be this person. You did not negotiate the standard. It was constructed from the outside, projected onto you with a completeness and a confidence that felt like being deeply known but was actually the opposite of being deeply known. It was being deeply needed in a very specific shape, and the moment you fail to hold that shape, the moment you have a bad day, a legitimate need, a moment of ordinariness that no human being can indefinitely suppress, the pedestal does not adjust to accommodate reality. It destabilizes, because it was never built to hold a person. It was built to hold a projection. And projections do not have bad days. They do not have needs that inconvenience anyone. They do not disappoint. And the moment you become undeniably, unavoidably human. The narcissist does not grieve the gap between who you are and who they needed you to be. They hold you responsible for it. There is a specific kind of conversation that happens in the idealization phase of a relationship with a narcissist that almost everyone who has lived through one remembers with a particular quality of bittersweet precision. It happens late at night, or in a quiet moment that feels sealed off from ordinary time, or in the particular intimacy that follows a period of intense connection. And in that moment you talk, really talk, in a way that perhaps you have not talked with anyone before. You go to places in yourself that you do not normally take people. You disclose things, fears, failures, wounds, the specific textures of your shame that you have kept carefully managed in every other relationship, because the conditions for full disclosure never quite felt safe enough. With the narcissist in that phase, they felt safe enough. And I want to be precise about why they felt safe, because the reason is behaviorally specific and important. The narcissist in the idealization phase is an extraordinary listener, not because they have made a strategic decision to gather information in most cases. That framing is too conscious, too deliberate, to accurately describe what is happening. They listen with extraordinary attention because what you are telling them is directly useful to the regulatory function you serve in their psychological system. Your interior world, your history, your wounds, these are the raw material from which they are constructing the model of you that their psychology requires. They are not tacky, NG notes, but the filing is happening nonetheless. Below the threshold of conscious intent, at the level where the system simply does what the system has learned to do. The research on self-disclosure and attachment is instructive here. Arthur Arendt's foundational work on interpersonal closeness demonstrated that mutual vulnerability, the progressive, reciprocal sharing of increasingly personal information, is one of the most reliable mechanisms for generating felt closeness between people. The narcissist intuitively understands and deploys this mechanism with considerable skill. They share, they disclose. They meet your vulnerability with what appears to be matching vulnerability their own wounds offered in apparent exchange, creating the felt experience of mutual exposure that Arendt's research identifies as the neurological substrate of genuine intimacy. What you do not know in that moment is that the exchange is not symmetrical. The narcissist's disclosures, however genuine they are carefully bounded in ways yours are not. They share the wounds that make them sympathetic, the vulnerabilities that invite care without inviting judgment, the history that positions them as someone who has survived difficulty without implicating them in the creation of it. Your disclosures, by contrast, go further. They go to the places where you are genuinely uncertain about yourself, the failures you have not fully forgiven, the fears that have not yet resolved into narrative, the specific unguarded coordinates of your deepest insecurities. And those coordinates get filed, not retrieved immediately, not weaponized in the next conversation. The filing system does not operate on that timeline, and understanding this is critical because most people, when they try to identify the moment their vulnerability was used against them, look for the dramatic confrontation, the obvious deployment, the moment when the narcissist clearly reached into the file and pulled something out. That moment sometimes comes. But more often the information operates differently. It shapes the quality of the pressure applied in conflict. It informs the precision of the withdrawal. It determines exactly which kind of silence will land hardest, exactly which implied criticism will find the gap in the armor most efficiently, because the armor's gaps were mapped in a moment of extraordinary trust and documented without the documentation ever being announced. Bessel van der Kolk's work on how the body encodes relational experience helps explain why this particular betrayal lands so differently from other forms of relational harm. The disclosure happened in a state of neurobiological safety in the attachment system's version of open, unguarded receptivity. The subsequent use of that disclosure, however indirect, however deniable, is experienced by the nervous system not simply as a social betrayal, but as a violation of the state in which the information was given. The safety was the we. Upon. The openness was the vulnerability that made the vulnerability possible. You did not give them ammunition. You gave them yourself. And they kept the map long after they stopped honoring the territory. There comes a point in almost every relationship with a narcissist where the accumulated weight of everything we have discussed, the audition, the hot and cold cycle, the triangulation, the fall from the pedestal, the slow realization of what was done with your disclosures reaches a threshold where you can no longer absorb it quietly, where something in you that has been patient beyond any reasonable measure finally reaches the limit of what patience can hold. And you say something. You name what has been happening. You bring the behavior into the open with the clarity and the specificity of someone who has been watching carefully for a very long time and has finally decided that the watching is over. What happens next is something that, once you have seen it clearly, you will recognize in under 3 seconds every time it occurs for the rest of your life. The narcissist becomes the victim of your noticing, not gradually, not after a period of consideration, with a speed and a completeness that is, the first time you encounter it, genuinely disorienting. The conversation that began with your legitimate grievance, your carefully articulated account of what was done, what it cost, what you need to be different, undergoes a structural inversion so rapid and so total that within minutes, you are no longer discussing their behavior. You are defending yourself against theirs. The harm they caused has been replaced, in the active conversational space, by the harm your raising of it has caused them. And the harm your raising of it has caused them is, by every measure they deploy emotional intensity, rhetorical elaboration, apparent sincerity considerably more serious than anything you came into the conversation to discuss. This is the victim pivot, and I want to give you the behavioral architecture underneath it because understanding its mechanics is the only way to avoid being captured by it every single time. The pivot operates on a fundamental asymmetry in how human beings process emotional information and conflict. When someone in front of us is in visible distress, when they are expressing pain with genuine affect, tears, the specific physiological signatures of hurt our nervous systems respond with a pull toward care, toward resolution, toward the reduction of the distress we are witnessing. This is not weakness. It is the attachment system functioning exactly as it was designed to function. The problem is that the narcissist's distress, in the moment of the pivot, is performing a very specific and very useful function that has nothing to do with genuine processing of genuine pain. It is changing the subject. It is converting the conversation from an accountability structure into a caregiving structure. And the moment you enter caregiving mode, the moment your primary concern shifts from the harm you came to address to the distress you are now witnessing, the pivot is complete. George Simon, whose work on manipulative behavior and character disturbance remains among the most practically precise in the field, identifies what he calls the covert aggressor's primary tactical advantage: the ability to use social expectations around empathy and care as a shield against accountability. The person who cries in the middle of being confronted is not, in most social frameworks, someone we continue to confront. The social script demands that we pause, soften, recalibrate. The narcissist has not consciously studied this script, but they have spent a lifetime navigating social environments with a finely calibrated sensitivity to what produces the responses they need. And what produces the response they need, when cornered by a legitimate grievance, is distress that redirects the social obligation of the room. What makes this particularly sophisticated as a game is that it does not require fabrication. The narcissist's distress in the moment of the pivot is frequently genuine. Being confronted, being seen, being held to account, being placed in the position where the false self is directly challenged is genuinely painful for them. The wound is real. The tears, if they come, are real. The sense of injury is real. It is simply that the injury they are expressing is narcissistic injury, the pain of exposure, of accountability, of the false self being challenged, rather than the relational injury your confrontation was addressing. Two different wounds, two different conversations, and only one of them ever gets to happen. Because in the room where one person is visibly suffering, and one person is the apparent cause of that suffering, the social architecture of the situation has only one available conclusion. You become the problem, not because the evidence supports it, but because the conversation was ruptured so quickly, so completely, and with such genuine emotional intensity that the original evidence never got its hearing. They didn't defend themselves against your truth. They replaced the courtroom entirely. There is a pattern so consistent across narcissistic relationships, across cultures, across demographics, across every variation in the specific texture of the dynamic that once you understand its mechanism, it stops being mysterious and starts being almost predictable. It is the return, the reappearance, the message that arrives weeks or months after the relationship has ended or gone cold, carrying with it a quality of feeling and a precision of emotional targeting that makes everything you had resolved about this person begin to loosen at its foundations. It comes in different forms. Sometimes it is a text that arrives at a moment of personal vulnerability you did not announce publicly, but that the narcissist somehow sensed anyway. Sometimes it is a social media interaction, CT on small, deniable, just visible enough to register. Sometimes it is a full return, complete with the warmth and attunement and apparent self-awareness of someone who has genuinely reckoned with what they lost. Sometimes it carries the specific language of change: I have been doing the work. I understand now what I did. I know I hurt you. Sometimes it does not explain itself at all. It simply arrives, with the weight of everything unresolved between you pressing behind it like weather. And something happens in your nervous system when it arrives that is not sentimental, and not weak, and not evidence of poor judgment. It is the attachment system responding to the reappearance of something it was neurobiologically bonded to, through exactly the intermittent reinforcement cycle we examined earlier with the full force of a bond. That distance did not dissolve, because distance never dissolves bonds built on variable reward schedules. The bond does not weaken when the reward source disappears. Research consistently shows it intensifies. The dopaminergic seeking behavior that Skinner documented in his lever-pressing subjects does not stop when the lever stops producing rewards. It escalates. And when the lever suddenly works again, the response is not cautious re-engagement. It is relief at a neurobiological level that can be genuinely indistinguishable from joy. This is what the Hoover lands into. Not your poor judgment, not your failure to have learned. The accumulated neurobiological architecture of a bond that was specifically structured, however unintentionally, to be maximally difficult to leave and maximally compelling to return to. The term itself, Hoover, named for the vacuum cleaner, captures the mechanism with uncomfortable accuracy. The narcissist sucks you back. But what the metaphor misses and what behavioral science supplies is the explanation of why the timing is so consistent, so reliable, so uncannily accurate. The narcissist does not return because they have processed the loss, reckoned with their behavior, and arrived at genuine changed understanding. They return because a regulatory need has reasserted itself. The external validation source, the mirroring function, the person whose presence stabilized a self that cannot stabilize itself, that resource has been absent long enough that the deficit has become acute. And the system, which learned very early that this particular source produces what it needs, initiates retrieval. The philosopher Martin Buber's distinction between I-thou and I-A relationships is precise here. The I-thou relationship treats the other person as a subject, a full, separate, irreducibly complex center of experience. The I-A-T relationship treats the other as an object, a function, a resource, a means to an end. The Hoover is not an I-thou gesture, however much it feels like one. However much the language it arrives in sounds like genuine reckoning with your specific personhood, your specific value. UE, the specific irreplaceable quality of what was lost. It is the system reaching for the object it has learned produces regulation. You are not being chosen. You are being retrieved. And the cruelest sophistication of the Hoover is that it is engineered again, without conscious design, to feel exactly like being chosen. Because it uses everything it learned about you during the confession phase, everything it mapped during the idealization, everything it knows about precisely where your hope lives and what language makes it rise. It does not reach for you generally. It reaches for the specific coordinates of the self most likely to open the door. We have now mapped the entire system, the audition that never closes, the hot and cold cycle and the neurobiological bond it builds, the triangulation that converts the relationship into a scarcity to be competed for, the pedestal constructed not as a gift but as a standard designed to fail, the confession trap that files your vulnerability. Why for later retrieval? The victim pivot that replaces accountability with a counter-grievance so emotionally compelling that the original harm never gets its hearing. The Hoover that returns not from love, deepened by loss, but from a regulatory need that has reasserted itself with the precision of a system reaching for a familiar resource. You now know what the games are. You know what drives them. You know what they are designed to produce and why they produce it so reliably. And I want to address directly the question that I know is sitting in the room right now, beneath the surface of everything we have covered. Because there are people listening to this who are not here for academic understanding. They are here because they are currently inside one of these dynamics, or they have recently left one, or they have left several and cannot yet understand why the same architecture keeps appearing in different faces in different relationships across years of their life. For those people, the question is not intellectual. It is immediate. It is, what do I actually do with this? And the answer is both simpler and more demanding than any tactical advice I could give you. Awareness is the exit, not partial awareness, not the intellectual recognition of the patterns combined with the emotional suspension of that recognition when the Hoover arrives, where the warmth returns, where the idealization restarts. Complete awareness, the kind that operates in real time at the moment the pattern activates, before the nervous system has completed its conditioned response. That kind of awareness is not a passive state. It is a developed capacity, and developing it requires understanding not just the narcissism but your own. Here is what behavioral science is unambiguous about. The narcissist's games do not work on everyone with equal effectiveness. They work with particular power on people whose own psychological history has created specific vulnerabilities that the narcissist system, TEM, is again, without conscious design, exquisitely calibrated to find. The person who learned early that love was conditional on performance is maximally susceptible to the audition. The person whose attachment history is characterized by inconsistency is maximally susceptible to the intermittent reinforcement cycle. The person who carries significant shame about their own adequacy is maximally susceptible to the confession trap and the idealization that precedes its collapse. This is not blame. I want to be unambiguous about that. The vulnerability is not a character flaw. It is a logical, adaptive response to a specific relational history that happened to you before you had any capacity to choose or resist it. But it is yours, and it is the territory where the real work lives. Because the narcissist cannot be changed. The games cannot be negotiated into fairness. The system cannot be loved into health.